welcome to this special edition of Catholic Current. From Washington, D.C., I'm Maura Moser. As the nation marks its 250th year, we are discussing and celebrating the contributions of Catholics to this nation. Today in studio with us is Archbishop Timothy Broglio of the Archdiocese for the Military Services to talk about the important role of chaplains. Welcome, Archbishop Broglio. Thank you for joining us.
I'm very happy to join you. I'm happy to participate in this celebration of our 250 years.
So tell us, just to start, about the origins of Catholic chaplains in the United States. Who was the first Catholic chaplain and how did it happen?
Well, the first Catholic chaplain was actually two Jesuit priests, Father Antonio Rey and Father McElroy. And George Washington wanted chaplains in the military. That's the first thing he asked for when the military, when he was given the commission as the commanding general of the Continental Army. He went back to the Continental Congress the next day and he asked for funds so that he could have chaplains. And he wanted them to do two things: meet the religious needs of the troops and tell him the truth. And those are still the two primary functions of chaplains today: meet the spiritual needs of the military and advise the command. Of course, there were no Catholic priests in those first chaplains because there were very few Catholics in the 13 colonies, with the exception of Maryland. And so there's some presence of Catholics on Navy ships in the early 1800s, but they were primarily there as teachers. And it wasn't until the Spanish-American War that Franklin Pierce was very concerned about this being interpreted as a war between Catholic Mexico and Protestant United States, because the conception was that the United States was a Protestant nation. And so he contacted Bishop Hughes of New York. New York was not yet an archdiocese, and asked for some priests. And so, like every good diocesan bishop, Bishop Hughes asked the Jesuits to provide him with some priests, and they sent two, Antonio Rey and John McElroy. Antonio Rey was actually killed during the Mexican-American War, and Father McElroy survived, and he went and founded actually my alma mater, Boston College, in 1863. And so that is really the beginning of the presence of Catholic priests in the chaplaincy. Now, at the time of the Civil War, as you probably know, most of the militia who fought in the Civil War were state militia. And so if the predominant religion of that particular militia was Catholic, there would be a Catholic priest with them. If not, would be a Protestant minister. And so generally, there were, we can say, 20 priests on the Union side and 20 priests on the Confederate side throughout the Civil War, but they changed. It was at that point that we first began to understand the need for some sort of oversight, because, of course, these priests were all diocesan or religious priests. They only had the faculties of their diocese. And so when they crossed over other diocesan lines, they had to obtain the faculties from the diocese. And remember, this was a civil war. So, for instance, the Bishop of Richmond threatened to suspend ad divinis any of his priests who ministered to Union troops. That's how intense the feelings were. And then with that, of course, the presence of Catholic priests in the armed forces of the United States began to be a regular occurrence, certainly in the Spanish-American War. And then in the First World War, when actually the Knights of Columbus provided the funds to increment the number of Catholic priests who were serving. And of course, they also tried to meet the needs of the soldiers in foreign lands by providing these little outposts with the motto, "Everyone welcome, everything free." And so they provided things that the American soldiers might need.
So it sounds like the history of chaplains is really intertwined with the history of the United States, but they didn't come until a little bit later in the American military history. What do we know about Catholics in the military at the time of the founding?
There were less than 1 million Catholics in the United States at that time, and so they were a small presence. It was, of course, before the great immigrations from Ireland and then from Southern Europe, and so the presence of Catholics was limited. We know, of course, that one Catholic signed the Declaration of Independence, Charles Carroll, but there isn't a great presence. It was a missionary church. Many bishops spent a great deal of time in Europe looking for priests and sisters to come and minister in the United States. So it was very much of an immigrant church. And of course, there was also a little bit of standoffishness on the part of other U.S. citizens because they were suspect, they were suspicious of Catholics, and of course suspicious also of the ties with the Holy See, which of course at that point was there were the Papal States, and so it was an independent nation as well.
And so how these early chaplains, and maybe even today, I don't know, how did they deal with anti-Catholic sentiment while they were serving?
Well, they dealt with it primarily by insisting on their rights. And of course, very quickly, they earned the respect of all of the troops. I think it's significant that all of the medals of honor that were given to chaplains in the Second World War, in Korea, in Vietnam, were all given to Catholic priests. Mm-hmm. So there are 7 Catholic priests who received the highest honor that the United States gives to military. And I think it's because of their valor, their willingness to speak the truth to power, that advising function of the chaplaincy, and also their incredible courage under fire.
I wanted to go back to something you mentioned earlier about how chaplains have served soldiers on both sides of wars. And at the beginning, they were serving Americans at war with Mexico, as you alluded to, which at the time, still a Catholic country. And those chaplains served both the Union and the Confederacy during Civil War. How did the chaplains approach that issue of serving opposing sides?
I think that they probably approached it with a certain amount of charity. The Civil War, while we have the reaction of some, there was also a certain amount of friendly exchange between the troops of both sides because the division obviously was somewhat artificial, and so I'm sure that probably the priest tried to build bridges somewhat. Of course, there's the great image of Father Colby, who was not a chaplain, but who blessed the Holy Cross priest who blessed the Union troops before the Battle of Gettysburg. But I think there was a desire on the part of them to at least minister to all and to be instruments of reconciliation to the point that they could be in a situation where feelings were very intense and differences were very sharp.
I'm sure. Now, in your time as Archbishop of the Military Services, you have known chaplains from both the past and present who have had amazing lives. Is there anyone who stands out to you in particular?
There are 3 who are amazing figures, and all 3 of them have been, there are many more than those 3, but sure. 3 of them who have been proposed for canonization. And that would be chronologically Father Verbis Lafleur, who was a priest of Lafayette in Louisiana, who, when it was obvious that the Philippines were going to fall to the Japanese forces, he was offered the possibility to be flown out, but he felt his place was with the soldiers who were going to stay. He was with the Army Air Corps. And so he he took on one of those roles that is, I think, very typical of a chaplain. Even though chaplains have no command, even if they're officers, he really became the leader of this band of prisoners of war. And of course, the Japanese tried to force them to contribute to the war effort, which of course is against the Geneva Convention, but when you're a prisoner, you're a prisoner. And so Father Lafleur very cleverly organized them, and they would make one step forward and about 3 back. And so it looked like they were contributing, but actually they weren't. And then unfortunately, when it became evident that the Philippines were going to be retaken by the Allied forces, Father Lafleur and the other prisoners were put on a prison ship, which was not marked as such, in the harbor. And the Allies torpedoed the ship. And so Father Lafleur died pushing people out of the hold to safety. And of course, he drowned then in the tragedy. However, one of the soldiers that he rescued converted to Catholicism, and he had a son who later served as a priest in the United States Air Force as a chaplain. So he obviously continued to give just by the example of his life.
Wow, beautiful.
And we have another figure in the Korean War who is Father Emile Capon, who actually also was a chaplain during the Second World War as well. But he asked to go back and again had the opportunity to escape when his troops were imprisoned by the Koreans, by the North Koreans, or I should say by the communist forces, really to be accurate. And he, again, was the leader of this band because, of course, they tried to brainwash them. And he continued to encourage them to remain faithful, not to despair. And he would lead, even though they weren't all Catholics, he would lead them in the rosary. And he was a good farm boy from Kansas. So he figured out where they kept the food. Of course, part of trying to keep prisoners under control is not to feed them very much so they don't have much energy. He helped himself to augment the food intake of the soldiers by stealing from the stores that the communists had. Unfortunately, because he gave of himself so much, helping to delouse his fellow prisoners, washing their clothes, depriving himself of food, he eventually succumbed to pneumonia and was taken to what was euphemistically referred to as the infirmary. It was actually a death house, and that's where he passed away. And his remains were anonymously deposited in this national cemetery in Hawaii called the Punch Bowl. Until just recently, they were identified and they were returned to the Cathedral of Wichita in Kansas.
Oh, wow.
So, and his cause is actually the furthest along of the three. We hope to see his beatification in the near future. The third figure, who is very dear to the Archdiocese for the Military Services, is Father Vincent Capodano, who was a Maryknoll missionary, became acquainted with the Marines in Hong Kong, where he was serving, and asked his superiors if he could become a chaplain. So he became a Navy chaplain, served with the Marines, and was absolutely fearless. He would go out on patrols with them. He wangled his way into all sorts of situations, basically to care for the men in his charge. And unfortunately, on the 4th of September, 1967, he was killed as he ministered to some Marines who had been wounded during a very, very intense battle. And he is also a Medal of Honor winner, as is Father Capon. And his cause for canonization has also been introduced by the Archdiocese for the Military Services, and we hope to see progress on that case as well.
Wow, I hope so. What incredible stories of bravery and just witness. Can you tell us a moment, and maybe you've already covered it with these beautiful stories, but it could be historical, it could be personal, when chaplaincy made a decisive difference?
Well, I think it's made a decisive difference in many instances. I can think of one in particular in just the approach of a commander during the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Mm-hmm. There was a Marine commander who was going to make quite a show of force as they came off the ship. And the chaplain, a very courageous man who's still very much alive, closed the door and said, "Sir, why don't we make an impression another way? Why don't we show that we're friends and pass out water?" Because, of course, in those countries, water is always something that's very, very precious. He convinced the Marine commander to do this. And so the soldiers made an impact, but rather than an impact of force, they made an impact as, we're really a friendly force. We're interested in you and in your welfare. And so I think that kind of activity on the part of chaplains is something that is very precious and very, very decisive. We could also talk about the times that chaplains have intervened when someone's contemplating taking his or her own life. But those are more kind of individual stories, most of which are not talked about in the public realm because of the personal sensitivities. Yes.
Now, we've been talking about military chaplaincy, which is one of the most visible forms of chaplaincy in the United States, but America has also developed chaplaincies in prisons, hospitals, airports, other public spaces. What does that broader picture tell us about how this country understands religious freedom and pastoral care?
Well, I think most medical professionals would tell you that medicine is something that is holistic. It is mind and body. Of course, we would say mind, body, and soul. And so I think there's a recognition of the importance that a chaplain can bring to a hospital situation. Certainly, travel in this day and age often involves stress.
Yes, you would know.
I would know, yes. So it's good to have chaplains in places like airports. And of course, the tremendous role the chaplains play in prison ministry is really quite incredible. There are so many instances where they make a difference in helping someone reform his or her life, and occasion a turnaround. I remember, this isn't directly related to the United States, but I remember when I was the secretary of the nunciature in Paraguay, I subbed a couple of times for a priest who was a chaplain to the women's prison, which initially was run by a community of sisters who were founded to, help women in prison. I remember obviously it was a very low security prison, but I remember just the privilege of celebrating for these women who were detained, and kind of a moment of uplifting their lives, and bringing them, of course, Jesus Christ in the sacraments, which is certainly something very, very precious and very important. As you probably also know, the Archdiocese for Military Services is charged with the hospitals of the Department of Veterans Affairs. So we have a priest in most of the 153 VA hospitals spread throughout the country, and in Puerto Rico and Guam as well. And so that's also another place where that personal ministry, where bringing Jesus Christ to the sick is a reality, and is something that is done with great great pleasure.
Archbishop Broglio, is there anything you would say to somebody who is considering military chaplaincy or another form of chaplaincy? What message would you have for them?
I guess I would encourage them because I think the impact that you can have is so great. And I think also, at least speaking about the military, the absence of Catholic priests is very dire. And so there's a tremendous need to supply priests for actually an area of life in the United States that contributes disproportionately to the number of priests who are ordained every year. There's a high percentage who either served in the military or whose parents served in the military. So I think there's also the opportunity, if you are a chaplain in the military, to influence the decision of someone who might be considering the priesthood.
Is there anything else you would like to add before we conclude today, Archbishop?
Just to thank you for this opportunity to talk about the chaplaincy, and also to remind our listeners of the other role that a chaplain plays in the military, and that is as a defender of conscience. So that is one of the things that any chaplain is required to do. If you have a conscience difficulty, the chaplain, of course, is the first person that you go to, and so it is a tremendous contribution to that freedom of conscience that is a part of our military system, for which we give thanks and for which occasionally we've had to work to defend.
Yes, I imagine. A point well taken. Archbishop Broglio, it's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for joining us for this special edition of Catholic Current. You can find out more about our ongoing celebration of America at 250 by visiting us online at usccb.org or follow us on social media at usccb. I'm Mara Moser. See you next time.